Good afternoon to Europe and good morning to North America. I'm Roger Hilton and welcome to Global Tremors. Joining me from Washington is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy, Ian Brzezinski, now Senior Fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Ian, thank you for joining us and welcome to Global Tremors.
Roger, it's good to see you. It's always good to be with the GlobeSec community.
Ian, we've had a packed day here in Europe. We've heard from voices from Kyiv, Vilnius, and now coming back to Washington as we did yesterday. For our audience out there, as we live stream this, we're going to go through some big ticket items when it comes to the news, and then we're going to get right to our questions. So the big news, everybody out there right now, is personal sanctions have been levied against Putin and Lavrov. Momentum is growing for Russia to be removed from the SWIFT, but by no means guaranteed. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has announced $350 million in military assistance. The big news item, as we've just come on air, is Turkey has banned Russian warships from entering the Black Sea, which is still unconfirmed from the Russian side. And on the domestic side, where Ian is, an FBI report has announced that Russia is allowing for a permissive operating environment for cyber criminals with Russia. And last but not least, as reported by the BBC, in the eastern city of Dnipro, there is literally an open-air Molotov cocktail session going on at the moment. So Ian, we're day 3 here of this Russian invasion. Let me start off by asking you, what is at stake for all of our viewers, and what do you make of the Ukrainian reaction to the conflict right now?
Well, thanks, Roger. I mean, this is a significant crisis, and it is one that has global implications. I'd say there's 4 things at stake, if you want to summarize it quickly. First, of course, is Ukraine's sovereignty. We're talking about a country that's being invaded by an authoritarian power, a country whose sovereignty is being violated. This is a people that are known for being accepting, for being tolerant, and for being one of the strongest democratic cultures in Europe. So Ukraine's sovereignty, the sovereignty of an independent democracy, is at stake. I'd say second, NATO's credibility is at stake. Ukraine may not be a NATO ally, but it is in NATO's interest to have a Europe that doesn't feature spheres of influence, that doesn't allow the states of the continent to be invaded by others. And how the West and how NATO responds to this will shape the confidence of its member states in this institution, but also the respect it generates among its adversaries. Third, this is an event that's going to shape profoundly Russia's evolution as a democracy and as an international actor. And here I'm kind of stealing from my father, who used to emphasize when he was alive that Russia cannot be a democracy if it continues to be an empire. And subordination of Ukraine would preclude Moscow's transition from its hegemonic past. And right now, Moscow is trying to resubordinate Ukraine. And if it does so, it's going to continue to be an imperial power. We're going to continue to have a confrontational, dangerous relationship with it. And then fourth and finally, what we're experiencing today is a blatant violation, an unjustified violation of the rules-based order that has kept peace and prosperity around the world since World War II. And if we're not successful in defeating this attack, we risk returning to a world of spheres of influence, a world of military coercion, this time one that features probably more active nuclear coercion, since this has been an element of this crisis today. So much is at stake. And your point about the Ukrainian response, I just have to emphasize how amazing the courage of the Ukrainian people have been, how inspirational the courage of President Zelensky has been. This is a people who are standing against all odds to defend their freedom, to defend their sovereignty, and thereby also our freedom and the rules-based order. They deserve our support, our full support.
Ian, I can't thank you enough for sort of your opening intervention here, and for everybody just joining us. A lot of issues to get to regarding NATO credibility, NATO response, and the signaling it sends to enemy, its future adversaries, whether it's Russia or potentially China. Ian, what I just want to pick on before we get to sort of David and Goliath is your declaration of sort of that the state of Russia as an empire and democracy are in intentions. And depending on if you've read Peter Hopkirk's book about the Great Game or Catherine Belton's book, it seems as if there's a certain segment of the Russian population who think that the default position of Russia is as an empire, And as they famously said, when a Russian flag goes up, it can never come down. So just getting back to this, this new DNA or this weak DNA of Russian evolution and democracy, do you think this might actually be a turning point, long-term for Russia, or is this only now putting the nails in the coffin on democracy in Russia?
Well, I think it depends on what the outcome is. If Russia succeeds in subordinating Ukraine, then we'll be close to the last nail in the coffin of democracy in Russia. But I think if Russia is defeated in this attack, this is going to be a huge setback for Putin. It's going to delegitimize him. And I think it will enhance actually the prospects of democracy getting traction in Russia. I actually believe that Russia has a possibility to shed its imperial past, so to speak. It can shed Putin's revanchist ambitions. This is one of the crises that will determine which way Russia goes. Will it go back to an imperial disposition, which is what we're facing today, or will it return to the track that we saw in the early 1990s, which was one towards democracy? I'm optimistic, but I got to say, a lot is at stake here on that direction, or choice of directions, based on what happens in Ukraine.
No, I mean, you couldn't be right. And Ian, it's great that you sort of brought up the themes of if President Putin is defeated and delegitimized. It goes without saying that in addition to the people in Ukraine and the presidents who are just putting up heroic efforts, the people who are putting themselves on the lines in Moscow and St. Petersburg, going out protesting, all forms of civilian dissent has been essentially exhausted and just put to bed by Russia. And when it comes to the imperial past, as you said, I think this interconnected generation don't necessarily associate with it. Let's talk about defeated, the battleground and defeated. Ian, the huge news that broke maybe 30, 40 minutes ago before we got on air here is that President Erdogan has banned, Russian warships from entering the Black Sea. Obviously a huge military move. What's your reaction to it on the military side? And what is going through President Putin's mind, thinking that he probably had a good working relationship with President Erdogan as strongmen?
Before I address Turkey and this important decision about the Montreux Convention and Russian access through the straits there, you're talking about Russia's evolution. Think of the generation that has been born or has matured since 1991. This is a generation that is more globalized, that has had more access to the world, has no interest in subordinating Ukraine or Belarus or other countries for that matter. This is an element of Russian society that is going to be profoundly dissatisfied with the course of events. And as the price of Putin's actions grows in terms of human life, because there are going to be body bags coming back to Russia, in terms of the Russian economy, in terms of the access of this generation to the rest of the world, Putin's created a potential firestorm that's going to really erode and bite at his grip on power. And I think this is coming, particularly if we enable the Ukrainians to sustain their resistance. As for the decision about Turkey, this is I haven't read this. I'm making the assumption that it's true. If it is, it's a good decision. But unfortunately, I don't think it changes the situation on the ground that significantly, because there really aren't more Russian ships coming in at least in a significant way, back into the Black Sea. Russia already has quite a significant military capability in the Black Sea. So it's a good decision, but not a game changer.
Ian, thanks for that, that unfortunately sober assessment of it. And again, also before getting on air, the BBC had reported that the French Navy had also stopped and towed a Russian tanker that was under embargo trying to get into the Black Sea and has either put it into French ports or sent it back to Russia. That's your reaction to the technical side, but the losses are mounting up for President Putin. The information warfare is not going his way. We'll get to sort of the military aspect, which I think he and his generals thought was going to be much better. But on a person-to-person level, even if this is true and it doesn't change the landscape of the military, what is Putin thinking that, wow, maybe they are actually united NATO allies?
I think Putin has become increasingly obsessed with Ukraine. And if you look back to his initial statement after taking office, when he said, back in around 2000, 2002, when he said that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then you fast forward to 2006, 2007, 2008, and he's already quite publicly disparaging Ukraine and questioning its legitimacy as an independent state, saying this directly to President Bush and to other leaders. You move forward to 2014, where he actually invades the country. And since 2014, you've seen kind of an intensification of his obsession with reacquiring Ukraine, manifested in this 5,000-word manifesto, and then further intensified in actually a very troubling way with his ramblings in the last two public addresses. This is a man who's almost deranged in his obsession to reacquire Ukraine and place it back under Moscow's control. It's a complete rejection of reality and a complete creative recreation of history in a completely false way. That is extremely, extremely troubling.
Yeah, I mean, the circumstantial evidence, and also whether it was sort of this charade of the Security Council being, trotted out and then having to endorse the decision, but it increasingly seems, that he's isolated in his decision making. He's not governing from the Kremlin. And like you said, I mean, there's a litany of domestic issues that the average Russian, I think, would prefer to have resources spent on, whether it's, living costs or healthcare. And this obsession, as you said, I don't think it rings true throughout the national security and those actually making these big groundbreaking decisions.
Your point about isolation is something that's increasingly of concern to many who watch the Kremlin. And you saw a very calculated and well-executed operation in Crimea in 2014 that led to overconfidence about how easy it would be take the other portions of Ukraine. And so you had the mistake in Kyiv in 2014. Mistake is the wrong word. The attempt to take you to Kyiv that failed miserably. The resistance that the saboteurs that Russia sent in, the provocateurs that Russia sent in, the forces that Russia sent in to Donbass and Luhansk, reflected an overconfidence that Putin had in the Ukrainians' eagerness to quote unquote return to his dominion. I think over time, Putin has developed a very false and inaccurate image and understanding of what Ukraine is all about. The fact that he thinks that 200,000 troops will be enough to retake Ukraine has to rest on the assumption he thought that the Ukrainians would embrace this attack. Because we're talking about 200,000 troops in a country of over 40 million people who are heavily armed and who've been fighting against the Russians for the last 7 years. To send 200,000 troops in there on the assumption that he could take even a significant portion of that, it's almost inconceivable, and has to rest on a very inaccurate understanding of what Ukraine is all about. So his misunderstanding of Ukraine is severely clouding his strategic planning and his execution of policies and efforts towards his efforts. He's created for himself a dangerous quagmire based on a false understanding of his neighbor.
Ian, this is exactly why we're having episodes like Global Tremors. For everybody listening, if you just joined, Ian has just made some unbelievable points right now about sort of the swift execution of the Crimean takeover in 2014 has now installed a sense of overconfidence in President Putin's strategic decision-making, and that it was a farcical idea to believe that only 200,000 troops would have been enough to take Ukraine, as you said, a country of 40 million with battle-hardened troops, a chip on their shoulder, and very intense military equipment coming in. So Ian, thank you for bringing all of that in. And for both of us, whether we're in Europe or North America or beyond, I mean, the idea that President Putin is isolated and might not be well mentally is something we should all stay on the lookout for. Let's return to the question of sustaining resistance, which was sort of a focal point of your early conversation. Yesterday, NATO heads of state and government, they had an extraordinary meeting where the SACR now has new abilities to move very fast or very rapid to forces. Now they're talking about they're going to start resupplying Ukraine. Ian, you've worked at the Pentagon before. For somebody out there, can you maybe elaborate or give us some insight on what the logistical operations of this look like? Will it be coming from Poland? Will it be coming from Romania?
Well, one, I have to say, I think those operations will be fairly classified. But I think there is a need and a benefit to demonstrating clearly that the West is going to sustain this resistance. And toward that end, I would actually deploy assets into Poland and into Romania, possibly Hungary and Slovakia, to ensure that we maintain a certain amount of control over the necessary airspace and ground space necessary for those resupply operations. That by doing some of that overtly is an important way to communicate to the Russians that they're going to pay a price, and we're going to enable the Ukrainians to impose a price on them. Two, it's important for the Ukrainians as much as possible, as many Ukrainians as possible, to see that we're doing this, in addition to seeing it through the actual delivery and use of that equipment and that support. And then it also is an important way to kind of further the momentum of international support for the Ukrainian cause, for the defense of Ukraine. So yes, this decision made by the administration to provide another $350 million of equipment, including lethal equipment, is really important. I support it. And I would only add that I'm sure they're working hard on how to get it in, but it might be also good to demonstrate publicly that we're actually doing that, and beyond rhetoric, so to speak, and assertions.
Yeah, Ian, it's great to hear, while you said that the actual deployment of the equipment or its, insertion into the country is probably under, confidential rules. That's a great point for everybody watching that, if you see this type of equipment moving through Slovakia or Hungary, it sends a message to Russia that we're not messing around and that it's coming. And it's not just for, a credibility of the alliance internally, but it's also to demonstrate and keep, the Ukrainian forces energized that this equipment is on the way. Ian,
Roger, if I could add, there are two other things. In addition to enabling the Ukrainians to fight more ferociously, and they are fighting ferociously. I mean, the fact that they're defending Kyiv with such effect is really amazing and inspirational. But we also have to more directly hit and more immediately hit the Russian economy. The Biden administration and our allies have moved in the right direction in terms of unleashing a wider set of financial sanctions, a set of sanctions on technology, attacking some of the oligarchs and Putin himself by seizing their assets. All moves in the right direction, but we need to do more. And particularly important is to really impose a complete embargo on the purchase of Russian oil and gas. That is the fastest way to shut down that economy. It has to be a complete embargo. And the financial sanctions have to be not just against selected banks, but comprehensive. We want a situation where not 3 months from now or 6 months from now, Russian starts feeling a financial squeeze, but we want the average Russian to all of a sudden go to a bank and find he can't get rubles from the teller anymore. Or all of a sudden have a refinery shut down and people losing their jobs. That's what it's going to take to really start transforming Putin's calculus about what he's undertaken.
Yeah, Ian, if I could just respond before getting to the question. I mean, obviously, a lot of the sanctions in their second rounds right now, they're long-term where they won't start to feel effects. But, Jake Sullivan, the energy prices are very high right now. Inflation is rampant around Europe and North America. So, I mean, at least the message coming out of the National Security Council, at least, was that they didn't want to target the oil or the energy commodities so much in Russia for the fear that it would be driving up prices globally, which would then increase prices and that Putin would pocket it. So I think there's some success that Nord Stream 2 has been suspended, but not to put you in the hot seat, but how do we square that circle about, protecting the American economy and not having the average consumer feel the pinch of higher energy prices?
Well, this is a time when sacrifices have to be made. I mean, we have at stake here the lives of 40 million people. We have at stake here the sovereignty of a European democracy. We have at stake here the international rules-based order. It's not just Russia who's trampling it. It's going to be others that follow if they see that Russia can get away with it. And so, yes, a full embargo on Russia, particularly its oil and gas sector, will have financial and economic consequences or blowback into our economy. But that's a fair price to pay. I mean, I got to say, when people say, well, we can't do this because of higher oil prices, that to me shows a certain amount of strategic short-sightedness. It's certainly an exercise of moral indifference to the plight of the Ukrainian people. And to be frank, it really reflects maybe the power of corporate greed in some sectors of our economies.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
the cost of higher oil prices, I think, is a fair one if it leads to a quick end to this Russian invasion and the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. That is a fair price.
Yeah, I mean, we're in concert on this message. I mean, I'm coming from Canada and you're coming from North America. Canada is home to one of the largest diasporas of Ukraine, which wields quite a bit of political influence. But if I'm just being honest with you, I mean, you've had candidates running for the Senate from Ohio, people like J.D. Vance, who have shown a complete disregard for this type of issue. So while I think the intentions of your message are really great, I'm not sure if it's actually totally acceptable around the population of the United States and maybe Canada. But let's stay away from domestic politics for the moment and get to my next question.
That's why you have shows like this, which is supposed to help explain why sometimes a little bit of financial sacrifice for the cause of freedom is well worth the investment.
Yeah, well, the one lesson from me coming a little bit younger than you, as we spoke about before air, I mean, I'm here in Austria and Slovakia, right on the border, and waking up on Thursday morning and seeing, missiles flying into Ukraine. I've been to Kyiv, Lviv, and Chernobyl. It's a bit jarring and unsettling, and even to the state, to think that somebody my own age would be conscripted to have to fight is something that nobody across Europe and North America ever thought would be possible. So maybe it needs a shock to the system for that to really take in.
And it's a shock. It's a shock that we'll be able to withstand.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm glad to hear that.
We're not talking about breaking our economies. We're not talking about throwing ourselves into a depression. We're talking about paying a few more cents or a few more dimes for a gallon of gas so that 40 million people can remain free, so that we don't fall back into a world of confrontation and increased risk of nuclear confrontation, if not conflict. We're talking about setting a precedent that will resonate around the world and reduce the likelihood of other aggressions, be it in Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, or what have you. So I guess I just have little patience for those who are saying, well, we can't do this because we're going to pay a little bit more at the pump.
And I couldn't agree. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, even if it was like future disruption of supply chains, or as you said, if there's a cyber attack on, something like the Colonial style pipeline, it goes without saying. But that's why not just this show, but the work the Atlantic Council is doing and other organizations about raising, visibility and educational outreach products about this is so important. So I think it's an ongoing work in process. And J.D. Vance doesn't speak for everybody in the United States, but it's hard to ignore from, somebody from my perspective.
Yeah, he represents a small, out of touch, but a small portion of the United States. I think there's a lot of support in the United States to do what's right when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Yeah. Let me just add that, one of the most important statements that came from the Munich Security Conference was from European Commission President von der Leyen, where she stated quite clearly that she believes that the European Union has the oil and gas that it needs to sustain a cutoff from Russia, from Russian oil and gas. That had to be, I would assume, had to be a powerful message to Putin. Yeah. And it's a message that we ought to be exercising. I should say the European Union should be exercising.
Ian, again, just another great point. I mean, I have a leg injury right now, not in Slovakia, in Vienna, Austria. And it was quite surprising to hear the energy minister here in Austria saying that even if it gets very cold, we have enough gas and energy products to get us until March. And, just again, for everybody, Austria has been neutral since 1955. It's not a member of NATO, it's a member of the European Union. So when you have a country like that, who traditionally has had very good financial and personal relations with the Putin regime, it actually sends quite a strong message. Ian, we're coming into the last part of our interview here, and it's been nothing short of groundbreaking to talk to you. all of us on, watching Global Tremors, I want to give you a little bit of VIP intel coming in. Earlier today, an Estonian member of the European Parliament of the EPP, Rio Teres, had an unbelievable thread going on about, what's going on with Russia, where Putin is held up. And Ian, I'll just let you know that according to Rio, President Putin is held up in the Urals. He's put oligarchs under house arrest with him there so that they can't flee, and that he is furious, with his generals and his military staff at how badly the war is going. And as you alluded to this earlier, there was an overconfidence. They are burning through resources, financial resources. He said, and I quote Ian, that the war costs about $20 billion a day. And that because of embargo sanctions already put in by the European Union, they are having equipment issues, where the only thing domestically that the Russian military industrial complex can make is rifles and ammunition. And that's not to even get into the resistance. So Ian, my question for you is, we've talked about his isolated state, his mental state, and you alluded to it in a very visual sense, but as the war drags on and Russian body bags pile up, do you think that there's any chance Putin will change his calculus and opt for negotiations? Or if they take Kyiv, you think this will reinvigorate the campaign and, he'll really see this through to the end?
He has bit off more than he can chew. And even if they take Kyiv, there will still be a government and there will still be a resistance. And the 200,000 Russian forces will be spread thin with long logistical chains that will be steadily chewed up by the Ukrainian resistance. And that's going to send casualties back home. That's going to send Kyiv back home, a tragedy for the Russian people. And, Putin may not change the calculus on his own calculus on his own, but I think the Russian people will start forcing him to change his calculus, because these are costs that they're not going to accept.
I hope you're right. I mean, obviously, he seems to at least been given the public image that whether it's his national security or the oligarchs, anybody who has even a modicum of influence is still having to back him. But, reporting on military casualties is a crime. And if you're watching Russian state media, everything is sunny in Kyiv. They're only showing issues in Donetsk and Luhansk. And, this morning on my first interview from Kharkiv, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry reported 6,000 casualties, where my speaker said that the casualties of the first 3 days of this war was combined more than the two Chechen wars. So for everybody's sake, we hope that he changes, his calculus on it internally, because it doesn't look like Putin himself will.
Yeah. Authoritarian regimes, I guess, compared to democratic countries, can operate often with greater dispatch and greater speed. They're certainly more willing and capable of acting with great brutality, but they're also brittle. And so they'll push sometimes irrationally to as far as they'll go, and then they just fragment because they don't have the resilience the democracies can have. And that's what Putin's creating for himself. He's creating for himself a situation where, yes, he can act with great brutality against a smaller, weaker power. But the costs to his regime economically and socially and physically are going to be profound. And I really believe he's chewed off more than he can chew. And if he's prudent, he'll end this attack and withdraw. If he's irrational, he'll continue it and he'll end up ruining his own regime.
Ian, here we're about to sign off here. Global Tremors, just to sum it up, Ian, before I give you a few last words, Ian has said very clearly that, President Putin is operating under a mindset of overconfidence and that he has extracted too much from the success in 2014. The decision to only deploy 200,000 troops to take Ukraine is a total failure. This is a turning point in the democratic evolution of Ukraine. And the final statement, Ian, which I think you said, is that President Putin, whether he's prudent or irrational, no matter what, has broken off more than he can chew. So Ian, as we sign off here on Global Tremors, our third episode of the day, what are your last words to our viewers and to, all of the unbelievable people in Ukraine, in the government and the population across the country?
In order for what I say, or what I said to come about, it's going to require not just the courage of the Ukrainian people, but the support of the international community of democracies to support the Ukrainians in their fight. That means not just rhetorical support. It means continuing the assistance that they need to fight ferociously. It means exercising our full economic weight against the Russian economy to break the fueling of this invasion. And it means robust military deployments to the region to reinforce our allies and partners and to further complicate Russian military planning. These have to be the key priorities of our efforts today.
Well, Ian, as we sign off, I mean, here's to both of us and our respective populations in Europe and North America paying more at the pump to defend democracy for 40 million people. Ian, thank you so much for joining us on Global Tremors. I wish you a great Saturday despite the specter of war hanging on the continent. And to everybody watching Global Tremors, we'll be back maybe tomorrow on Monday with more interviews. So to everybody out there in Ukraine, don't ever give up. We've got your back, and we'll talk to you a little bit later.
Roger, thank you for all you're doing on this crisis.
Yeah, we'll talk to you guys later. Thank you.